Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Roleplay Chat. I'm Matt, Game Master who can't stop talking about role-playing games, and in today's episode of Roleplay Chat, I am joined by Gnome Anne to talk about horror games, running horror games, preparing for horror games, and how to tap into your fear and set the right mood and tone for your game if you're trying to get spooky for Halloween or the spooky scary season, or really for any time of the year. We also have the return of the Indie Showcase this week. This week we're going to be talking about Plant Girl Game. It's an awesome, fun game, very narrative focused, and it talks about family and, a family of plant children, plant people going off and trying to solve an ecological crisis. We're going to be talking about Plant Girl Game about at the 30-minute mark of the show. So if you're interested in checking that out, you can jump over to there. But otherwise, I encourage you to sit back, relax, enjoy the chat about horror. Anne provides a lot of really awesome insights and advice as it pertains to, how to game master a horror game. I know we're all probably pretty familiar with a lot of the tools and methods that we use when running a regular game. So translating that into a horror lens is something that I know I've struggled with, so I really appreciated all of her insights and advice. So anyway, let's dive right into it. I hope everybody enjoys today's episode, and happy Halloween. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Roleplay Chat. I'm Matt, a game master who can't stop talking about role-playing games, and today, just in time for the spooky, scary season, we're going to be talking about horror TTRPGs. And it's going to be a doozy. I hope you all are excited. Joining me today for this chat on horror and scary and spooky is a horror aficionado. They are an award-nominated TTRPG creator who has worked in a variety of spaces in the hobby. They are a TTRPG writer, streamer, and actor. They are an avid world builder and storyteller who streams their game prep on Twitch, as well as on a variety of actual plays, with credits on shows such as the Beach episodes, Eldritch Disco, and the New Jersey Web Fest nominated Zipota. Did I say that right?
Zapotha. Yeah.
Zapotha. Which is a really cool show, a mix between teen drama and eldritch horrors. It's really a neat time. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Gnome Anne to Roleplay Chat. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. What an intro. Jeez.
I do my research. I gotta make sure all y'all joining me are the cream of the crop, and you are without a doubt one of those cream of the crop TTRPGers. So I'm super excited to have you here today, Anne. Can't wait.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's dive right into horror. So today we're going to be covering three main pillars of conversation. The first is going to be talking about systems and systems that we like to use for horror games. Then we're going to talk a little bit about advice. I have kind of like a rapid fire section for you, Anne, where we're just going to be like shooting through a bunch of different things that people are hopefully familiar with already for regular games, and we're going to try to add a horror spin to it. And then, if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about tools, inspiration, and resources for running horror games. Does that sound like a plan?
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. So let's jump right into it. I take it you like horror games.
I love horror games. And it's I run a lot of games. I run, high fantasy, absurdist comedy, and all that good stuff, drama shenanigans, but I have such a profound and deep love of horror, and especially in TTRPG. I like in every media, but something about TTRPG horror is just my favorite thing.
There is something special about being transplanted into like a new space, right? You're literally living the life of somebody else. Um, and you get this opportunity to explore spooky, scary places. So definitely. When we talk about running horror games, is there kind of like a baseline system that you like to use, or like a setting that you constantly come back to?
Not really. I love exploring new systems, and I think different systems do really good at specific types of horror because
Mm.
horror is such a huge genre. It's really hard to classify whether something is or isn't horror, and different games are going to do really good jobs at bringing you into different types and kind of helping facilitate different types of stories. So, like, Zapotha is a kids on bikes game. Kids on bikes wouldn't normally be a go-to for horror, but because I was doing a teen slasher, that it
Mhm.
actually worked really well for that kind of system. Um, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for, like, general, horror, and, yeah, I've got, like depending on what your thing is, there are so many different systems that I'd recommend.
Yeah, well, okay, well, you know what? Maybe let's back it up.
Okay.
Since you definitely know way more horror and about horror than I do, are there, like, certain classifications of horror that people coming into it, people listening today who are like, Halloween's coming up. I want to run a horror one shot for my table. Are there? I imagine there are like subgenres within it. Uh, do you feel like you would be able to kind of like rifle through what some of those subgenres might be?
For sure. So coming from, like, you know, a lot of these classifications started from literature and then went to film and then went to TTRPG or wherever they ended up, right? So horror is just anything that's designed to frighten, to evoke a sense of dread, or repulsion, actually, is a common word. Something that's supposed to kind of ick you out. That's horror. And within that, we often divide it into two genres of psychological and supernatural horror. So, psychological being anything that looks at the sort of darkness of the human psyche. It's
Mm,
specifically talking about, like, usually it deals with like mentally unstable people, or some people who are sort of personifications of like the darkness that lives in all of us. And then supernatural is something that departs from the reality we know in some way. And that I really like supernatural horror, and it might be being used to interrogate the dark psyche, but I want to do it with a little bit of a surreal or weird flair is what I really vibe with. And then within that, you have so much. You have things like gothic horror, which are primarily based off like ambiance and setting and just a sense of wrongness. You have cosmic horror, which is my beloved, which is
mm,
usually when there's the entity that you're fighting is so unknowable that to perceive it is to addle the mind. And it's something that is so much more powerful than you that there's no way you could ever fight it. Um, which is you need a very specific system to run a game like that because, like, a lot of them, it won't work. And
yeah,
then you
yeah,
have
yeah,
things
yeah.
like, yeah, like your slashers, your creature horrors, anything where it's like a monster or anything. And, some like, d- just some, well, I'm doing is I'm going to throw in systems. So,
Yes, yeah,
uh,
go for it.
like Monster of the Week is a fantastic game for running monster horror and you can really do a lot, with that. Even though I wouldn't necessarily think of it as like a horror game, the mechanics are set up really well for monster horror, and it has a lot of things that guide the GM into preparing a really good monster horror. Um, versus anything that deals with like cosmic horror, it's going to be quite specific. The go-to is Call of Cthulhu. I'm like not a huge Call of Cthulhu fan. Don't tell anybody. Um, but I recently ran a game that was Moonlight on Roseville Beach, which is a queer disco cosmic horror, and it's kind of
Nice.
like yeah, it's like Scooby-Doo meets Lovecraft, kind of, and it does a
Yeah,
really good
yeah, yeah,
job with
yeah.
that kind of very niche intersection. Um, and yeah, and then, obviously you have, like, the World of Darkness, right? For more, like, monster specific ones.
Man, that's awesome. I'm gonna have to like listen back to us talking several times just to kind of like take
We need
notes
a
from
flow
all of that.
chart.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
flow chart of the all the different types of horror. But I love that. And I think you touched on something there that I think we ought to repeat. It's different systems are gonna do a good job of kind of enabling a certain type of horror to happen. Games like Monsters of the Week, where yeah, it's this episodic cycle of fighting a monster, adding on the layer of spooky and horror and tapping into the emotions of your player. You can do that, and it's propped up by the rules of the game. You talked a little bit about like cosmic horror and like these eldritch abominations and whatnot. I've played a little bit of Call of Cthulhu, and I do think it does a really good job of balancing, like, having your sanity as, like, its separate resource, and like, these, like, permanent, going insane effects that can happen. I think that it addresses the big and spooky beyond in an interesting way, but it doesn't quite elicit fear, does it? I think that that's where it's lacking. Is that maybe why you're not a big fan of Call of Cthulhu? What about it specifically?
Well, personally, I don't like a sanity mechanic.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so and that's just like as a neurodivergent person who's dealt with mental illness, I'm like,
Mm,
okay, don't call me nuts. It's rude. I do. It's funny because I'll do similar things like in Moonlight on Rosal Beach, there's like a scared mechanic, which is essentially the same thing, where you become so frightened you can no longer function, or you become so much that you can't think clearly. It is really the same thing. It's just something about the way it's framed, especially because Call of Cthulhu is a specific reference to like Lovecraft's writing, in which
yeah. Well, yeah.
a lot of that isn't
There's a lot of problems with Lovecraft's
right.
writing. Yes.
So I think you can run a Call of Cthulhu game that wouldn't like get to me in the same way. It's just that it's always about like the table expectation and where those come from. And I think because it's drawing on that body of work, it kind of sets the expectations for a certain type of story, which is
Mhm.
not totally the version I want to tell. Um, but if you do, go for it, whatever your
Yeah,
table
that's
wants.
hey, that's fair,
Um,
that's fair.
I've played Call of Cthulhu games that I thought were genuinely scary. And I wasn't the one running them. I've never run a Call of Cthulhu game, in all fairness. But I do feel like, because that's the thing, right? You can run a horror game in any system. It really depends on how much heavy lifting you're putting on the game master. Because sometimes what you're essentially asking is the GM to write you a horror novel and then to try and play it through, which is so much work. And for people who maybe aren't huge horror buffs or aren't writers or just wanting to run like a one-time horror for Halloween or something. Like
Yeah.
you don't need to be steeped in this to run a great game. You just need a game that's going to help you do that. So that's why I think that certain games like, you mentioned Alien, like the stress mechanics
Mhm.
of things like that. Anything with like a panic table or a stress mechanic or dread. I won't play dread because it stresses me out too much. For anyone who doesn't know, Dread is a game that uses like a tumbling tower, like a Jenga tower, as the mechanic. So as you act, you have to pull blocks, and then if it crashes down, you essentially perish. And like my heart can't handle the stress of a Jenga tower. Um, but like that's such a beautiful mechanic for really quickly creating tension, even if you're not like some horror author, right?
Yeah, definitely, and I think you touched on something super cool there. Any system that has physical representations of the game, it adds tension, and by adding tension to the people playing the game, you immediately make everybody on edge. So games like Dread, where there's a physical tower that can fall, in the physical space that you're occupying as players, that it's gonna make it easier to scare your players. Same thing with like a game of 10 candles. I don't know if you've ever
Yeah.
played a game of 10 candles, but you've got the candles. They're out on the table, and if you're too loud or you bang the table or whatever, you risk putting a candle out, and you risk shortening the lifespan of the people playing the game, the characters playing the game.
No, of the
Hopefully,
people at
hopefully
the
not the
table.
people.
I always end my game of 10 candles with a mass murder.
So it's yeah, 100% as and I can vouch for those things because I don't consider myself to be good at scaring people. Like I really rely on these tools that foster an atmosphere of dread that you can
Mhm.
then tap into that sentiment. So 100%.
I think that's kind of the magic of TTRPG, right? Because most of us aren't horror writers, but you can feel like one for a
Mhm.
single game, because it's helping you along, and that's a good system, right?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So if you had to pick one right now, like you're running a horror game tomorrow, what's that gonna be in? What system's that going to be
Okay,
in?
so funny thing, I am running a horror game tomorrow, and, the system we're using is Under the Autumn Strangely,
I've never heard of
which
that. That sounds super cool. What is it? Tell us about it.
okay, so it's kind of like it's influenced by Over the Garden Wall, um, but really leaning into the eerie and ominous side of it. The whole premise is that you are lost in a sort of nightmare escape that draws on pastoral horror and nostalgic Americana where everything's a bit off. And one
Hmm.
thing I love about this game mechanically is it is a GM-less system, but there are three roles that you can, like one person in each role, or you can have multiple people in each role. There is the traveler, who is the closest thing to like a player character. There's the Arcadian who is there to create the world, and their whole job is to evoke autumnal melancholy and to create
Oh.
strange and unexpected people in this world. But one person's job is just the terror. And their job is just to yes and to make everything scarier in a specific way that they've outlined at the beginning. And in terms of, like, trying to run a horror game, I think this is so good because often as a GM, it's so much to keep track of, like, world building and tension building and balancing, and so you've actually split those apart now. So you have
Hmm.
one person who is building a world and kind of doing your typical storytelling, and one person who's just there to make it scary.
That's
Um,
their job. Yeah, make it scary. Let's ramp everything up to 11. That's super
y
cool.
yeah, and I think it's a really fun way to do it if I mean, I have a bunch of, like, people on it who have done a lot of horror, but, um, if you aren't, I do think it's kinda cool to be able to, like, keep in that focus because it really helps with that element of storytelling.
But, does it play with just 3 people then? Like, one person has each role and that's it? Or can you
Yeah,
scale it up and down?
you can scale it, so you can have multiple people in each role, up to, like, 2 for 6,
Mm,
and
cool.
at which point you have, like, 2 terrors who are conspiring with each other, to make things worse, and we did a sort of like test playthrough of it recently, and it's not your typical structure because there is no GM. So every single person at the table adds to the reality. So everyone can say like, "There's a tree over there. It has a lantern hanging from it," and the next person says, "And as you watch it, the glass on the lantern begins to crack." And then they go, and then the light spontaneously lights, and the next person's like, and it shines bright red. And it's
Mhm.
like, it doesn't put all the onus on one person to think of cool stuff, which is,
Yeah, that's awesome.
nice.
That sounds really cool. So, I mean, I'll link that up in the show notes for people listening. Under the Autumn Strangely by Graham Gents, I
I think
think.
it's
Is that
oh
it?
god, I hope so. I was hanging out with Graham the other day, but I didn't ask for the pronunciation. Sorry, Graham. Gertz?
Oh, is there an R there? Gertz?
Maybe not. Did I make that up? I'm not
Anyway,
looking at
it'll
it.
be in the links down below, and people can fight over the pronunciation. But that sounds like a really really awesome game, and I think that there are so many of these indie darlings that people can check out, especially in the horror space. I feel like
Mhm.
it's like this treasure trove of of waiting to be discovered. So definitely worth checking out. That's super cool. Um, one system that I've been looking forward to running is Mothership, kind of like switching the pendulum to another direction. Mothership is a space horror game. Uh, I got the opportunity to play it in Toronto actually this spring. I went to Breakout Con. Is that what it's called? Breakout Con? Anyway, I went to Toronto to play a bunch of games and had a blast playing Mothership. It's very like it's not the same sphere I feel in horror as this autumn game, like the vibe is very much you're alone in space. There's strange sentient AI walking around in robot form and like it's a little bit gruesome in places. I found it's very graphic in the way that it presents its horror. I think it's like a lot of body horror. Is that the right term?
Yeah, body horror describes like anything that usually is happening to a human or animal body in a way that is unnatural or grotesque.
Yeah. So there was a lot of that. But it spooked me out, and I was playing at like 11 a.m. in the morning, so I couldn't even imagine being in like a cabin in the woods playing this with like four friends on candlelight. Like, like that would be I wouldn't sleep for weeks after
Oh,
that.
yeah. I'm a huge fan of like the Alien movies. And like that's Mothership in a nutshell. And well, one of the people who's going to be in the Under the Autumn Strangely show I'm making is Cameron of the Panic Table, who runs like a Mothership show.
Oh,
Uh,
cool.
so I'm like, and named after the Panic Table, which is one of my favorite mechanics in that game, which is like when you start to panic
Hmm.
as you gain too much stress, because then you start gaining the mechanics like as you gain stress, it's instead of having like a hit point that goes down, you're gaining stress,
Hmm.
and at some point you start rolling on a panic table, and then things start going really wrong. Just like when people panic in real life, but
Exactly.
a little more ominous.
Yeah, with some dire consequences for sure. Um, but cool. So I think that covers at least a handful of interesting systems for people to try. There's a lot of really cool mechanics too. I think if you poke around in some of these systems that we talked about, Call of Cthulhu, Alien, what was it called? Into the Autumn Strangely, Under the
Under the
Autumn,
autumn, strangely,
Under the
yeah.
Autumn Strangely.
Oh, I have another one that I mentioned, a mechanic I wanna tell you about,
Yes,
uh,
please.
which is from Moonlight on Roseville Beach, which was Eldritch Disco was run in that system. And I love this because it works off like a D6 pool system, and so you have a number of successes, but you assign your dice to various tables, meaning that frequently as a player, you have to decide whether or not you want to achieve your goal, become injured, or become scared, which has
Hmm.
like mechanical things.
Yeah.
And it like we were talking about like adding tension at the table, like a kind of meta tension, is because people are there sitting there like, oh, do I want to fail this roll or do I want to get stabbed or do I want to risk like losing like mental control of the situation? And like adding that kind of like the stress of like the person figuring that out is like, oh, it's so good.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah. 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 That's
and
cool. And that decision making, right? Like the micro decision making, I think is so much fun. It's the same. I think the same kind of micro decision making happens in in Alien, right? When you're like deciding to push yourself to
yeah, yeah, yeah.
to like basically roll better now, but you're pumping up that is it the panic track? I forget what it's called exactly. But there's like a
I
you're
thought
basically
I
giving the
yeah,
game
stress
master
mechanic. Yeah.
some kind of token resource that they get to use against you next time. And you can see the pile like building up. I think there's a similar mechanic in Star Trek Adventures too, which is not meant to be a horror game. But there's kind of like this give and take where you can take a better role now at the expense of like more drama later, and you can physically see the pile of tokens like pile up as the game master gets more and more control over the potential situation coming up. So
I love that, like, second autonomy of the player. I think that's actually really important for horror, because if it's just something that happens to you, it doesn't feel tense.
mhm.
Um, Even, like, in a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, like in Monster of the Week, there's a mechanic on a mixed success where it's a hard choice, where essentially your GM presents like, you can either, like, succeed or cost or, like, and something about that of like, okay, you decided to take an action, you decided to roll, you did, and now I'm going to present you with an almost impossible decision to make, and you have to make it right now. It's
It can be a
excellent for
lot.
building because that's the
Yeah.
hardest part of running a horror game, right? Is building tension. Because realistically, what we're doing is quite silly. we're a bunch of people sitting around playing pretend. It can feel very silly. And so if we're all going to agree that we're going to do this in a way that is like trying to be scary and unnerving, and that we're going to try to build up some tension, any help from the game to do that is really good.
Definitely, definitely. And I think like you're saying, right, it can be a lot on a player when they don't have an out. But if you give them an out or like an option to take narrative control now at the expense of narrative control later, you're kind of striking both of those things. You're like, okay, you get to have your out now, but the thing that comes after, it's kind of because of you. Like you made this decision.
You own it, and I think
Yeah.
this is something I talk about a lot in, like, horror more broadly, but, like, the real twist of the knife, the anguish that we're seeking is always at the intersection of what is and what could have been,
Mm,
and you don't get that unless there's a sense of autonomy, in the sense that you could have done something else, and it might have resolved differently, and so when the moment comes when the monster is bearing down on you, you know that in at least in part, you scripted your own demise, and that is what we're chasing.
yes, 100%, 100%. Awesome. So I think while we're building up the tension, let's cut it real quick. We're gonna go to the indie showcase. We're gonna have some quick words from an indie creator, and then we're gonna jump right back into our conversation with Anne about horror and horror games.
Yay, indies.
Hi, I'm Dominique Dickey. I'm one half of Sly Robot Games and the designer of Plant Girl Game. Plant Girl Game is a game about a family of plant children working together to stop an ecological disaster in their community. It's for 3 to 5 players, including a GM, and it's ideal for one-shots or for short campaigns. And it's really open-ended and low prep, with narrative power being distributed around the table. A big part of this comes from the collaborative world building that begins the adventure, where players work together to create and define their town, their home, their mom, and their relationships to each other. The book includes 3 adventures that you can pick up and play, along with tools for GM and players to make their own. As far as what inspired Plant Girl Game, there are a lot of answers to this, and I am very impressed by artists who can identify the creative lineage of a specific work because my brain feels more like soup. Like a lot of stuff goes in, and you can't always tell what ingredients make it into a given bowl. But I will do my best. So the earliest idea for what would eventually become Plant Girl Game took root after I read The Tea Dragon Society by Kay O'Neill, which is a wonderful graphic novel that I highly recommend, and I believe you can find it for free online. From that, I really became curious about cozy vibes, and by cozy, I mean as in creating a space for comfort, not as in avoiding nuance or challenging topics. Um, the Tea Dragon Society is also a coming of age story, as well as a story that is about people in community, but in ways that are tied to nature and to rituals of relating to others. So for a while, I thought Plant Girl Game would be a graphic novel, but it usually takes me a while to match a concept to the form in which I'll eventually execute it. So a lot of the time, I'll take an idea in one direction and then realize that I'm working totally in the wrong form for what it needs to be. And then another huge factor in creating Plant Girl Game is that the summer after I graduated college, I got really nostalgic and had a lot of dread about being an adult. And I revisited some of my favorites children's literature. So things like The Penderwicks, The Westing Game, When You Reach Me, from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, books that really form my sense of self in ways that are so deep seated that they become invisible, but that I was able to see more clearly with the benefit of hindsight. And I realized in doing that I love stories about children because there's this period of time where you start to see all the injustices that are around you, all of the nonsense that adults take for granted because that's just how the world is, but you don't understand why because there really isn't a good reason for why. And I really wanted to write a game that made room for that indignation because kids are really good at asking why something is the way that it is, or pointing out something that's not really fair. And that can be really healing to return to as an adult. And then the undercurrent of all of this, and a kind of background hum of most of my work, is a very healthy dose of climate anxiety. I would say that I am an indoor kid who is deeply fascinated by the natural world, and I really work through that fascination in art. So, some of the ingredients that went into making Plant Girl Game, as best as I can define them, are storytelling with a focus on community, and stories that are about children, because playing a kid gives you the freedom to call bullshit, and a desire to create roleplay experiences that leave us feeling powerful in the face of a scary and out of control world, and ideally, roleplay experiences that encourage us to exert that power in real life. And I think that listeners of the show should check out Plant Girl Game because it's fun, it's easy to pick up and play, and its mechanics for interpersonal relationships and community connection are simple but really deep. It has really cute art, and I already said this, but it's very fun.
Thanks, Dominique. It is indeed very fun. Plant Girl Game is a very charming role-playing game. So now in the next couple minutes, I'm going to do a quick review of Plant Girl Game to kind of give folks listening a sense of what I enjoyed and the things that maybe I thought weren't exactly my cup of tea in the game, just to kind of give a little bit of extra context. So, thanks, Dominic, for sending me a copy of Plant Girl Game. And like I said, it is indeed a very fun and charming game. I think what Plant Girl Game does best, and kind of as you alluded to in your inspiration and your explanation, is it provides players with a space to explore interpersonal relationships. It really provides just enough mechanics to support those interactions and that role play and kind of that borderline therapeutic exploration of self, of how we feel in our home, how we feel with our family, and ultimately how we work together to solve through problems despite our differences. I think Plant Girl Game has a lot of really interesting elements included within its gameplay, and all of those elements really do come to support the core gameplay loop of Plant Girl Game, which ultimately, and you probably already said it, Dominique, in your explanation, but I'll repeat it for the listeners, is that to me, Plant Girl Game is a game about families. It's designed to tell stories about those families and kind of, again, having those folks in the family work together to kind of resolve problems. In particular, in the game, that the main conflict is an ecological crisis going on that's going to affect the plant players and their home. So that's kind of the objective of the game, and like I mentioned, there are a lot of fun mechanical ways that we can play the game to encourage roleplay. But by no means is Plant Girl Game a game that is very mechanically crunchy. The characters have 3 stats. Whenever we resolve conflict and roll dice, we're rolling 1d6, and each character has kind of 3 player powers that they can use to have a significant advantage in resolving certain situations. Basically like a veto card to help direct the conflict or the story or the resolution in a certain direction. So if you're coming in and you're listening to this and you want something with a lot of crunch, I'm not sure Plant Girl Game is going to fit that niche for you. On the other hand, though, what it does extremely well is it enables this structure to have these potentially very deep conversations about family, about resolving conflict within family, and it does a fun way of kind of providing you with that foundation. A big part of playing the game is collectively building your plant mother, your home or house, and the town that you're playing in. There's kind of like a baked-in component of Session 0 in the game that helps guide you through this collaborative creation, asking you questions about who you are, who your family is, who your plant mother is, things that they do well, things that they do to support you as their child, things that maybe they are not so strong at, things that, might cause some small conflict despite the fact that they're trying their best and they love you. We all have our weaknesses. Same goes for the house and the town. The game prompts the players with a series of questions to go over the good and the bad and and kind of how that interacts with each element that you create is kind of left up to you to explore when you go and play the game. I guess you're already playing the game by creating all that stuff. But I thought that was a lot of fun, and I'm always a big proponent for games that get everybody involved in the creation of the foundation of the game, because that's what's gonna propel the drama and the social interaction as you move forward. This does mean that you're gonna kind of need at least one session just to do the creation component, and then probably a second session of play, or a third or fourth or fifth session of play to go through and try to resolve those conflicts. Now, I'm sure you can rush through the creation and kind of have it all get done in one fell swoop of like 3 or 4 hours, but it's kind of fun to stew in the creation of your world and of your plant mother and stuff like that. So I guess that's kind of, your mileage may vary depending on your preferences and your table's preferences. A couple of other really fun stuff that I found in Plant Girl Game is the inclusion of 3 fully written one-shot adventures for you in the manual, in the game book. So you've got 3 adventures that you can go on. Now, of course, because the game is very narrative focused and a lot of the quote-unquote conflict is these internal dilemmas between the family members and the ecological disaster that they're facing off with, it does rely a lot on your players to really tap into their roleplay. So for that reason, the pre-written adventures are more of a framework, and then it's left up to you and your table to kind of interact with and create these scenes to address the problems as they arise. But all in all, Plant Girl Game is a delightful, charming game with beautiful artwork, very cute characters, and has the potential to really be what you want as far as, are you exploring the psychological elements of being part of a family and, in all its glory and all its flaws, the community that surrounds that family and the town that community finds itself in as it faces adversity and this climate crisis. So I think really it's a good time. If that kind of stuff tickles you in any kind of way, you 100% need to check out Plant Girl Game. There'll be a link for the game in the show notes. Thanks again, Dominic, for sharing a copy of the game with me, and I hope everybody listening goes to take a look at Plant Girl Game. All right, we're back. Thanks for holding. Thanks for listening to that. And as always, the Indie Showcase game is going to be in the show notes with an affiliate link. So if you want to buy it and you want to also support me, you can do both. So let's keep going now, and now let's give some advice for people who are listening who want to run a horror game, whether that be for Halloween or not. Just general advice, and I kind of, at first, before asking the internet for some inspiration, I kind of just gave myself a list of things that I think are relevant, just as a game master in general. When we're preparing a game, regardless of what genre or topics we're covering in that game, we need to think of certain things. I was hoping we could do like a rapid fire, just like go through some of these things, and pick your brain on what kind of special considerations someone might need to have regarding that topic, with horror like tacked onto it. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Yes, good. I hope that made sense to the listeners too. So, maybe it's better off if we just start. We'll just start, and and that'll do more of the explaining than I need to. So let's for instance, when you're getting ready to play a game, you might be preparing combat in your game. When you're preparing combat in the context of a horror game, what's something that we should keep in mind as a game master as we prepare, as we run combat, you name it. That
Okay, one of the
yeah.
first things is that a monster that you fully understand is usually not scary.
Mhm.
Um, something that if you know the rules and know what it takes, then either you know you're doomed or you know that you're gonna win, and either way, not super scary. If you're trying to run horror in a combat game, it's about understanding what information to hold back and how to sort of shift the ground beneath the players so that as soon as they think they've figured out what's going on, it's like there's another rug pull.
Mm,
Uh, and
that's
and
super good advice. Yeah, I
yeah,
agree.
it's really hard to do in some systems. Like I say, like D&D is the one where I say it's the hardest.
Yeah.
Um, but other systems less so.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I'll add to that in that if you're gonna have combat in your game, like you were saying, the combat with the monster, like the big scary monster, shouldn't be till your act 3, like the end of your one shot or whatever. Like unless you want to have a scenario where like the monster is sort of around, but it's unkillable and you want it to like run away or whatever. But
No.
even then, it feels like kind of like you're giving it plot armor, so I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah. The second and I feel like this very strongly about horror movies and books and everything too. Once you see the monster, it's always so much less scary than what you were concocting in your own head because
Mhm.
what you are making up based off the unnerving tension that's built is very catered specifically to you and your fears. And so some other person is never going to be able to do as good of a job. So the second you reveal the monster and you show your hand, it's like you've kind of shifted things and you have to kind of keep things wibbly wobbly in a new and different way. And I think it's much harder after that point actually to maintain tension.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. One thing that I think people can do is to kind of have like tiers of the bad. So like maybe the big bad is in charge of like minions and
Mhm.
something like that. That way you can still have like the enemies for the people to fight, for your party to fight, while slowly learning tidbits about who's in charge and like the real thing that we should be afraid of. But
In Eldritch Disco, there was a line from like an NPC that was because they were fighting this monster and they kept almost dying to this monster, like barely getting away by the skin of their teeth. And then it's revealed like, oh, you like these things are feeding off you, but they're like you are not the prey, you are the chum.
yeah,
Like this isn't the monster. This is just some artifact of it being in your general vicinity because it's an Eldritch horror, and so it like and I think that was the moment they're like, "Oh, so we're doomed. Okay." And so like, yeah, if you're gonna do tiered, you can do like minions. You can do things like if you are gonna try and do D&D, like having them deal with the consequences of the monster having been through a space. So you're seeing the evidence of
yeah,
its in the past. And so they're trying to be like, okay, so it, you know, put a giant pit in the ground and then a bunch of stuff emerged from there or whatever. And it's like, okay, but what was this thing that just tore the earth in two? Uh-oh. And so then you're building up the tension and you can do that through combat without the actual combat of the monster
hmm
TM.
yeah. That's great. That's great. All right, next rapid fire. Since we're talking about
Okay.
it, what about enemies? So like the kinds of enemies, whether that be combat or social or whatever, what kind of obstructions, what kind of conflict, uh, quote unquote enemies. I mean, maybe calling it enemies is the wrong word. Let's call it like obstacles. What kind of obstacles do we want to see in a horror game when we're getting ready for running a horror game?
I think if you don't want to sit and write a whole novel, the best way to do it is to come up with your underlying theme of like, what are we actually scared of here?
Mm,
And then all those things can align and all work together to evoke that theme. And because then even the mundane can become elements of horror. Like if Okay, let me think of an example. Um, okay, so in a game I ran like yesterday, uh, the theme that I was evoking as the terror in that game was decay.
Mm,
And the central theme was around like a relationship that was decaying, but we wanted to do it through a horror lens. And so what we had as this element of like the obstacle, okay, they got stuck in a bog and began to sink. And it's like you're being pulled and you're being pulled under. And then one of them has like they pull out their leather boot, and the leather boot has a mushroom that has fruited from it. And I say the mushroom fruits because it remembers when the boots were skin. And it's like those elements. Because once you know that you're dealing with a theme of decay,
yeah.
you can bring an obstacle that is a pile of mud, a scary boot. Like, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like, it
Hmm.
doesn't have to be inherently frightening in itself. It's about the context of these things coming together and what we're trying to communicate that makes them horror.
Yeah, I love that. And to kind of build on that, I think once you have a theme that you're sticking with, usually whatever resource the party needs to combat that thing,
Mhm.
just just make it scarce. So
Yeah.
by introducing the scarcity of cleanliness in a space, now decay becomes more abundant. And like having that balance of like enabling certain safe zones, but then oh, now the safe zone isn't quite so safe anymore because we're running out of that resource that's protecting you. That's going to start playing with the players, right?
Yeah, right? Like, oh, you're sinking into the bog, you reach for a tree bench, and then you watch as it rots in your hand.
Mhm.
And it's like, because we're bringing in that same element. I also think this is really important for like improvisational storytelling because there's no way you can prepare in advance all the cool obstacles and menaces that they're gonna come across. So as like a storyteller, if you just like, okay, here's a sort of motif, a theme that I'm trying to evoke, then it becomes a lot easier to tie that in as you go
Mm.
without feeling like you're like laying track in front of a train.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Because what is scary is going to be very dependent on kind of what's happening in the game, right? It needs to be
Exactly.
natural, it needs to flow. So it's tricky. And I know people out there listening who like to prepare and like to kind of have control of the situation. That's going to be hard for you to hear. I know it's hard for me to like to do when I run a horror game, but it's needed. It really is.
I have
Especially in
strategies to help.
yeah, no,
I
exactly. That's why we're here. That's why we're here
Yeah,
chatting.
because I love to prep too.
Yeah.
But usually what I do is I come up with a theme and then I just like brainstorm as much stuff as possible that I think evokes that theme in a way that is kind of ominous.
Mm.
So that way, instead of I don't show up to the party with a prepared meal, but I do show up with a full buffet behind me that I'm ready with. And then I'll cook as we go.
Yeah, yeah, that's really great advice. And I think everyone will have their own way of preparing that kind of stuff. For
Mhm.
you, how does that look? Like what kind of elements how do you organize those elements in a way that is like accessible to you while you're playing so that you can just like whoop, you can like pull them out of nowhere and make it look flawless, you know?
Yeah, I do a lot of prep that is character based. Like I work a lot. Usually I'm a GM, and often that means I'm not. So I think a lot about if I have a villain, like I get like really into their motives. Like I have like a whole like what is their misbelief that led them to
Mm,
this? What is their sunk cost? What have they already lost for this belief? And then what is their plan? And this is something from Monster of the Week in their GM guide, that like section that is so good, their keeper guide. Um, where it like plot out what their plan is the whole way through if the heroes don't interfere at all. And all of that makes it so much easier to adapt nimbly. And then, so I have all that, but that's mostly just kept in my head. It's like a journaling exercise more than anything. And like, I don't really refer to it.
yeah.
And then I just have a pile of word salad and cool imagery that I put in this little notebook that I keep next to me at all times. And And then as we're playing and somebody says something that I'm like, "Oh, that," like, in the game we're playing, someone mentioned that they were wearing leather boots that had a crack in them, and I was like, "That's decay. Cool, check. I'm
Yeah,
adding
I
it to the
see.
list." And then I, kind of draw connections there, and I feel like it ends up feeling thematically coherent, and, like, isn't just, like, me riffing, because I've kinda done that prep and then can easily
Yeah.
slot things into the word salad.
Yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense, and especially being, like, actively listening and looking for opportunities to, like, integrate it with what's going on,
Yeah,
I think that's super
and
important.
that's why it helps to have, like, your theme really clear in your own mind is because then you're listening for, like, key words, like, they mention
Mhm.
any tie to that, and, like, and any you know, like, in Eldritch Disco, the main theme was, like, the monsters, like, eat despair, and so it was about grappling with dark emotions and, like,
Mm.
losing yourself to the like, just joy, and, some people took that as, substance abuse, some people took that as, like, talking about depression and things like that, but in whatever case, so anytime a player mentions something about their relationship with processing really dark or negative emotions, I'm, like, there with my pen, I'm like, "Alright, we're adding it
Let's
in,
go. Yeah,
whatever you said, it's on the list now." Um so it's like, "Oh, you
super
have
cool.
a sad song that you listen to all the time. Guess what the motif is gonna be every time the villain shows up that you just hear echoing around you?" Like, things like that, you know?
Mhm, mhm, definitely. I love that, and speaking of a sad song, why don't we talk a little bit about ambience and, like,
Mm.
the role of music at the table and how to set the tone just right. What kind of stuff do you like to do when you're running some of these games to kind of set that tone, get the right playlist going, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I love having a playlist that suits the theme, and, like, that also gets into the kind of, like, branching,
Mm,
is it a dark synthwave one? Is it, like, just, like, generic, like, creepy horror music? Is it orchestral? Those kinds of things. That's always really fun. I think lighting is really important. There is nothing scarier than a dark corner in a room,
mhm,
and so that helps. Uh, but realistically, I'm a person that when I'm reading or it doesn't I get so immersed in story, like, I get so lost in the sauce that I could be on the beach and, like, I would still be quaking in my boots, like, it's like I truly, like, get pulled into the
yeah.
story, so I think it often I that's more of a thing for other people, and so it's whatever that helps them kind of vibe, and then
Find
I
their way, yeah. What about, like,
Mhm.
I know a lot of the horror games you've run that are, like, actual plays, you're playing virtually. So do you
Yeah.
have a strategy to kind of help emulate that in-person feeling in a virtual space? Because I can never quite figure that one out. That to me is a
Uh,
mystery.
I think one of the big things is hanging out before the show or before the game,
Mm,
on a call, and so the the frames on our little boxes start to fade away as we're just, like, vibing and it doesn't feel so much, especially when it's gonna be a performance, like,
yeah.
it has this layer of artificiality, so we wanna remove as much as we can, um and I often have, like, a shared playlist I send everyone to listen to locally, often copyright music that I can't actually use in the show, but I'm like, "I made you this," and so we all started at the same time, which is fun.
That's
We did that a
cool.
lot for Zapotha, yeah, but other than that, and that's also kind of one of the nice parts is such because it is remote and because everyone's in their own environment, they can tune their environment to what feels appropriate to them.
Yeah,
Um
that's true. Do you, like, if you were to run a game, um, not not to be streamed, but you were playing
Mhm.
digitally, would you kind of give people, like, a heads up, like, "Hey, set up your desktop to be spooky," like, m make it your own? Like, is that, something you would recommend to people, perhaps?
So, uh, not to revisit Trot and Cramp, session 0, in, or pre-show or pre-game chat even,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
like one of the biggest things with horror is that everyone so the one thing I say what we're trying to do here is build tension, and everyone at the table has a silver bullet to immediately destroy all tension. Like it really is like we've all got veto here, and at any point someone can make a fart joke, and then what was just very scary becomes very silly, and we all laugh and feel a little foolish. And like that is what I'm trying to avoid at all costs.
Mhm.
Like there's nervous laughter, and then there's like I'm starting to feel uncomfortable, so I'm ducking out and kind of sabotaging it. Which, boo. And so the way you get around that is one having like even more robust safety conversations in advance so that people feel safe enough to be uncomfortable. And
Mhm.
so I'll go beyond like a typical like lines and veils where especially if I come up with a theme that we're going to interrogate, I'm like, how deep can we go into this theme before people are going to start being like too real, right? And then we set up things. One thing we use is I mentioned is like an O mechanic, which is like where this is good for virtually too, but you can do it in person. Like you do X to be like stop this, but you can do an O to be like I love this. What you're doing right now is great. This is
That's
really
super cool.
and I used it for the first time in the horror game like I did yesterday. And it was so good because sometimes I say stuff and I'm like, "Hey, was that too messed up?" Like, are my friends looking at me like, "Hey, why was that in your brain?" You know what I mean? And instead they're making like this little like, "Oh, like we love it.
Yeah, lay it
Ovation."
on some more. Let's go.
Right? Especially as you see their faces contort in horror that they look repulsed and then they go like, "We love it." You know, it's like it's nice and it
Yeah.
helps us kind of keep in there. But like once you have all everyone on board, once you have that buy-in and everyone's usually people will just do it themselves. Like they know they're coming to a horror game. They know what kind of themes we're going to do, and they're going to build the experience to be what they want it to be. And because we've all agreed on what we want it to be, it's going to be aligned. So
Mhm.
for some people, they might be like, I'm at risk of getting too scared, so I'm going to be in a brightly lit room. And then I'm like, that's great, actually. If that's what it takes for you to be able to really dive into the story, that's awesome. Um, that's cool. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
like if it's not streamed, I'm turning out the lights. I'm in the dark. You could like my poorly lit face, and that is it. And I'm like, this is gonna be horrifying. And I'll
Yeah.
have my windows open, but it's just dark outside, which is also one of the scariest things. My neighbors are probably like, what is going on there? But I'm like, it's spooky.
Yeah, speaking of like lighting, it's funny because for the longest time, whenever we would get into like spooky territory in my circle of friends, even if it wasn't for a role-playing game, just like, telling scary stories at the campfire or whatever,
Yeah.
we'd always like go back in and turn all the lights on. But then somebody once told me, he was like, this scares me more because now whatever's out there can see inside and can see us. And I was like, whoa, you just ruined my safe zone, man. Like,
Oh my god, one of, like, a horror fodder is, like, this one time I was staying alone in a cabin in the woods, don't worry about it, and it was, like, just, like, a rental or whatever, and there was no curtains or blinds in this single room cabin, so I was alone in the middle of
yeah.
the woods with
Mm.
all these, like, black glass windows staring at me, and you would hear, like, the movement of the trees outside. I was like, "This is how I die. Do
Mm.
would the curtains realistically keep me safe? No." Like, but there's something about it that I'm like, "Oh, this is rough."
Yeah,
No, so good.
that sounds terrifying.
It was
Um,
great.
yeah, yeah, no, this is all fantastic advice. What about for specifically, the pillar of play that people like to call exploration, where you're wandering around, learning about the environment that you're in. What kind of advice can you give for game masters when they're running these elements of a game?
So, a core part of horror is that the players don't know the rules of the world. They don't firmly understand what is or isn't possible, what can or cannot happen. But
Mm.
as the game master, assuming you're running a system where there's like a separate gaming player and game master, as the game master, you do have to have quite a strong understanding of where the weird ends and the more concrete rules of reality begin, what can and can't be changed. Um, and then the role of your setting as you explore is largely to be unnerving. The role of the monster or the villain or whatever is to be the terror, is to be the horror behind the curtain, but the role of the setting is to be unsettling. And so I always go for, okay, I know that like there are some basic rules like, you're in a haunted house. I know that the house can't physically change shape. That is a rule I have made. I might change it. We'll decide later. But okay, the house can't shape. But maybe sometimes the you go past and the wallpaper is peeling and then you come back and it's not peeled anymore.
Mm.
And that is acceptable for the rules that I have set up. And meanwhile, as they're exploring the world, they're trying to figure out where the lines are, where they are, like so they're trying to find their little sanctuary, their safe zone where they can retreat to. Um, it's horror. There is no safe zone. Ha ha ha
Yeah,
ha.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah. And
that's
as far
largely what the
as
exploration does.
yeah, and as far as like making things unsettling, do you
Mhm.
like lean back into the theme that you have? Like how do you like I have like I want to say like a dozen things in my toolbox that I'll bring out to like quote unquote be unsettling. But they don't feel very specific to anything. Like they're just like from media that I've consumed that I'm like,
Yeah,
"Oh yeah, when that scene in the body like fell down from the sky out of nowhere, that scared the living hell out of me." So I'm gonna make that something that I try to incorporate into my games, but it feels unnatural sometimes. So I'd love to
totally.
know like how you create unsettling things
I
inspired by the theme that you have.
Okay, one of the jokes I have for, like, movies is, like, the difference between horror and comedy is largely, like, lighting and music.
Okay.
And what I'm saying there is, like, the same element, like, a cracking boot. It can be scary or not scary depending on the context. So, coming in with, like, a bunch of things I think are scary, it can fall flat sometimes because if it
Mhm.
doesn't make sense in the context, it's like, "Wait, what? I don't get it," versus if it's, like, a building tension with a payoff, then that's something different. So I would think more is, like, really getting into what scared you about that situation? Like, what really freaked you out about it? So, like, for example,
Mm.
I'm scared of heights. Um, and I don't know, you let me know if this is too dark, okay? But when I say
You gotta oh, keep going.
okay, well, you can, but like when I think about like what really scares someone about heights,
Mhm.
it is the fear of not only the fear of dying, but I think it's the fear of the delay between knowing you're going to die and dying. Um,
Mm.
and also it is the fear of that strange urge we have to jump from a great height. And so I'm like, okay, those are scary. So now when you're talking about like this falling person, it's like if we're leaning into those themes of the fear of staring down the inevitable when there's nothing you can do, or the fear of not
Mhm.
trusting yourself, then you can start to play with that. So if the fear is not trusting yourself, you could lead to, the example I gave of like kind of like low key gaslighting of like the things changing around you. Your perceptions aren't reliable. You do things and they have different effects, mechanics that alter behavior, things like that. Um, and then when that thing comes, it's like it hits because it's resonant because it's been building up to that theme.
Yeah, I see.
And maybe that person who fell, like, you saw them and you were having a conversation with them a minute ago, and the next thing you know, you go inside, walk down a staircase, and you see them falling through the window, and you knew they were up on there alone. You know what I mean? Like, you're like, "Oh my god, what just happened?" And it hits because you've
Mhm.
been building up the tension on a specific theme, um, versus, like, just the thing in isolation isn't necessarily that scary.
Yeah, yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. So if I can like try to repeat what you're saying because that's how I understand
Mhm.
things. You're saying to have these almost like micro environmental things build up to something that is kind of founded in the fear of the players or their characters, I guess. Is that kind of
Probably the players, but
probably
yeah.
the players?
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, totally. And so that's how you can and so if you have an idea, you're like, "I have this image in my head that I think is so freaky, and I want a story about that." You can kinda unpack of, like, what is it that scares me about that? How can I build out a world that hints at that fear, that evokes it in
Hmm.
small ways, and that's the kind of unnerving, unsettling element, and then leads to this big scene. Um, and yeah, like, it's not that and so you kind of like yeah, it's about I would say the hardest part is the building of the tension, and then your image will really resonate.
Yeah. Okay. I like that a lot. I'm gonna have to run a horror game now just to like put it into practice. But I really I do like that a lot. Maybe let's go with one last one of these rapid fire questions, and then I have one other one that I think I'd like to cover that came from the internet. But what about like just logistics? Like I feel like when we talk about running a game, the duration of that game, the number of
Mhm.
people playing the game, um, how frequently the game ought to happen, those kinds of like more logistical questions. Are there certain considerations that we should be factoring in to those decisions as they pertain to running a horror game?
Yeah, I don't think horror like, in my experience I mean, again, everything I've said here today is in my opinion, in my experience, caveat, caveat. Nobody yell at me people will yell at me anyway, but, I don't think horror is very suited to long form campaigns. Because if it's long form, then either there's very low risk to the characters,
Hmm.
or we're coming in with the notion that we're going to churn through characters, which also takes the risk away, takes the, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Um,
because you know they're just gonna die, and you're like, okay, well, I'll have another one next week anyway, and it's not
yeah,
quite as
right. And unless you're exploring different themes, because over time, like I think they kind of start to peter out in terms of
mm,
a capability to raise tension on one theme. So I always like to say, like, logistically, you're going to have shorter runs, a few sessions. You can do a one shot. It's harder. I would say a longer one shot. If you can get your friends to lock the door for like 5 hours, like
yeah.
you'll probably
That
have a
feels
good
like
game.
the
But
right window.
yeah, shorter than that, it's hard because I always like to introduce the normal world and the regularity before I start to disassemble it in front of their eyes. So there's isn't much time to do that because if you don't care about the characters, you don't care about the world, it's hard to invest in the story. But sometimes you do what you got to do. Sometimes it's like, okay, you guys have 10 minutes to hang out and be witty, and then things are gonna start going wrong for you. um, and yeah, so for that, another thing is pacing is really important for horror because I think, like, in horror, you're trying to evoke a sense of stress, right? Like, the tension is stress.
Hmm.
And so things like feeling like I've used, like, physical timers, like an egg timer on the table to be like, "Make your choice, it's ticking." Um, and things like that to literally move story.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
and it adds tension. I also think horror is really interesting in that, like, for me, a good horror story like you said, the monster reveal is at the end. So, it's actually kind of, like, slow as opposed to, like, an adventure story where it's like, "And then we fought this guy, and then we did this, and then we did" it's more like we're building, we're learning, things are going wrong, we're putting out fires, and then the big reveal happens, like, 5 hours in.
Hmm.
So, yeah, it's, like, kind of slower in terms of plot, but the pacing is still there in terms of, like, other elements. And then the logistic things. Okay, party size. I think horror works better with smaller groups. I think my friends are too funny and cool that if you get too many of us, we'll start riffing and hanging out and not committing to the horror.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I do think
Sometimes it's
smaller
hard
groups
to
work
get people
better.
to yeah, sometimes it's hard to just with like three other people, you're like, "Uh-oh. I can already feel it. We're losing track of like
That
of the reason we're here."
that's also the thing. Is like there honestly aren't out of like the general world, the people who want to play horror and like really are like brave enough to like get into it, because a lot of people are going to bail as soon as they feel tense. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, then I'm like, then that's not fun anymore. Like, I saw this like TikTok of this girl who was reading. She's like, yeah, I'm reading this Shirley Jackson novel. And then she listened to it at double speed while doing her dishes, and then said like it wasn't even scary. Not a good book. And I'm like, of course it wasn't.
Yeah.
You had one foot outside the whole time. Like, what do you mean? And so like if you're coming to the table and you have one foot out at the table the whole time, it's like I don't know. I guess you can still have fun, but it's not the kind of game I like to run. So I think honestly, usually it's a small group just because it's hard to find people who are weird enough to want to do this with their spare time, to actually want to hang out and tell scary stories with the intention of being scared.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you touched on it briefly earlier, this idea of like expectation. But maybe
Mhm.
we ought to have like a dedicated chat about that. Like
Yeah.
because I think that's like the foundation of the whole thing. Like if you're gonna have a horror game, you gotta all be on the same page that you're having a horror game and that we're gonna feel a little bit uncomfortable, but we're gonna use the safety tools to make sure that it's in the lane that where everyone's is happy to be in. I mean happy, quote unquote, to be
Yeah.
in. Um, but yeah, so maybe I'll pass the microphone over to you as far as like laying those expectations down. How have you had the most success in doing that?
So we all do things like media comparisons of like what kind of are we going for Scooby Doo? Are we
Mm-hmm.
going for Cabin in the Woods? Are we going for Buffy, the scary episodes? Are we going for Alien? Are we going for The Witch? Like, you know what I mean? Like what
Mm-hmm.
are we doing here? And then so cuz sometimes people say I love horror and they mean with the lights on while doing the dishes at double speed. They love it, which is fine, but that's like if one person comes expecting that and another person comes expecting Scooby Doo and another person is expecting like Eldritch horror, then we're not going to have a great game together. Um and then the other thing is like really talking about safety tools because like often like usually we talk about safety tools like as a safety thing. Like it's about and that is obviously important. I think we all agree. I'm just going to assume if you're listening you agree. If you don't, boo. Um but like player safety is important, mental well-being more important than any game. But also, it gives you an appropriate way to indicate that you are too uncomfortable without destroying the tension of the table. So it
Mm-hmm.
also is a storytelling tool in a horror game where you can tell people, "Hey, walk it back," without intercepting and shattering the tension, which is typically what people do when they feel too uncomfortable. So, when we talk about that, like I talk about like specific safety tools of like what to do if you're starting to feel too tense. If you're starting to feel really uncomfortable, like what are we going to do and in advance so that and I ask people like please don't do it by shattering the tension, but like we'll make sure that you have a way. I'm not actually here to upset you.
Mm-hmm.
Um and having that conversation is all part of that intention setting.
Yeah, that's super important. I think a situation like this happened last weekend. I went up to a friend's, helped him close his family cottage, and had a
Mhm.
wonderful weekend just hanging out with a bunch of people. And at some point in the night on the Saturday, we're like, hey, let's play a role playing game. And I had brought 10 candles with me, but I had also brought um, Blades in the Dark with me. And I'm like,
Yeah.
do we want to do a heist? And we can make it goofy if we want, and I can like bend some of the rules to make it a little bit goofy. We can do like an Ocean's 11 thing. Or do we want to like sit down and be scared and like commit to this like tragic exploration of our emotion? And we decided to play Blades in the Dark, and I think that that was the
Yeah,
right decision because if anybody lied about their intention and we played 10 candles instead, it wouldn't have been fun for that person, potentially multiple people. Like, you know what I mean? Like you need to know when it's the right time to pull out the scary game, and with the right
totally.
people.
And, like,
Yeah.
I love horror comedy. I would actually I, like, kind of classify both Zapotha and Eldritch Disco as kind of like horror comedy. Heavier on horror than comedy maybe, but it's like it is really important that we all agree, like, are we going into, like, a very intense game, or are we like because that's still a great game. It can still be a great
Yeah.
game, but yeah, so long as we're on the
100%.
same page. I'm so glad you didn't play 10 Candles with someone who would have rather been playing Blades in the Dark.
Exactly. Exactly. It would have ended poorly, I think. So I'm happy. And we had a fantastic game. It was so much fun. And we laughed like the whole night long. And it was a whole different kind of
And that's great.
uh, atmosphere. Yeah, and it's just as good.
And one thing I'll say is you can have horror elements in a not horror game. You can still describe a really like eerie moment or scene or a
Mm,
specific unnerving setting, like a little pocket of horror in an otherwise non-horror game. And that's great. And then everyone gets like a little dose of horror, and then they go back to the game they're more comfortable with, and we all had a little laugh about it, and we're good. So that's also something you can do if people aren't actually wanting to like dive headfirst in, which I think
yeah.
is great.
And
You lure them
actually,
to the dark
and
side.
yeah, you can lure them in slowly with
Yeah.
little bits. What you said reminds me a lot of a question we got from Rara Storytime on X. Um,
Hi,
and they mentioned, the line
Rara.
between horror and spooky slapstick. It can be kind of like a fine line. Like
Mhm.
you mentioned, right? We're all one fart joke away from us just laughing it off. Um, but specifically when you said you can always have a pocket of horror in a game that's not horror, how do you tread the opposite? Like, do you entertain a pocket of humor or a pocket of levity in a horror game? And how do you make sure as a
Mhm.
table that it doesn't kind of snowball into Scooby Doo? You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. So, I love horror comedy. Um, I think sometimes it's great because we wanna empathize with the characters, and sometimes seeing them on a good day helps with that,
Mm,
right? You see them laughing with their friends, you want them to survive more. So you let them have their moments of comedy. Um, okay. Now, again, this is assuming we are all safe and aligned and we're all in the goals. I'm not springing this on someone who thinks they're showing up for a comedy game. They know what they're into. Okay.
mhm,
I have this like analogy as a GM where it's like, okay, I say that terror is the moment you're a child and you're lost in the crowd at a carnival and you can't find your mother. And this is terror. You are lost. And then horror is you see her and you reach for her hand and she looks down at you and that's not your mother.
mm,
Um, and it's like the reveal, right?
yeah.
Sometimes as a GM, we're all having a little haha, we're all having a little joke, and then they reach for your hand and you're like, and I'm like, just kidding, that's not your mother. Like, you thought I was in here with you?
Eh,
I I've just been
no.
gathering ammo to use against you this whole time. And so it can be often as something like as simple as like this NPC, this silly NPC that you've been riffing with. You know, what if you're talking to them and their facial features start to blur in front of you?
Mm,
Okay, hey, bud, what was that? We were having a good time, weren't we? What if they start like their voice starts like clipping or almost skipping like a record and they're talking, and then you're like, I thought we were. Hey, I
yeah.
misread the
Yeah,
room.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and so sometimes you can use those moments because so much of it is like what I say is like in a horror there is no the horror is looking for sanctuary when the game master knows there is no sanctuary. So sometimes when you prevent a moment of levity, you're like, oh look, you found a sanctuary, and that's just another chance for a rug pull.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
of like, don't worry, you found a safe place. Just kidding, nothing's safe. You're in a horror game.
Yeah, that is super neat. That's such a fun way too to, like, play with expectations, right? Because I think people will be used to playing with expectations in other contexts. Send people on a mission to get the treasure.
Mhm.
Oh, when you get there, there's somebody else there that you have to fight that you didn't expect to be there. Well, now we're just doing the same thing, but the like reversal is with the intention to scare. You know, like I really like that. Um,
And
that's
I
super
think
cool.
too, part of it, like, we talked about is like so much of horror is like it's the players are trying to learn the rules of the world. And so if they think now that they're in like a comedy setting, they think they know the rules because they know the rules
Mhm.
of comedy. And so that gives you like when you subvert that, you immediately bring it back to horror, even if it's a minor subversion of like, oh, you thought you knew the rules, no, you don't.
Yeah, yeah. That's so. I was getting shivers just thinking about the character whose like face starts to clip and anyway, that'll be that's cool. That's really cool.
I got so much more weird stuff where that came from.
I'm
It's
sure.
weird stuff the whole way down.
Sure, I'm sure. I mean, you're getting me really pumped up. I want to like play in a horror game before before Halloween time comes around. Um,
Yes.
I'm gonna have to make it happen. I'm gonna have to make it happen. Um. Anyway, I maybe let's ask one more question. I'm looking at the clock. We've been talking horror for quite some time now. Um. Maybe just your top tools, your top resources as it comes to horror games. And this can really be anything. Like it could be software or websites or a book or sources of inspiration. If you had a couple of things that you could be like, these are my go-to resources for running horror games. Is there something?
I don't really know if I have them in that way. I think the go-to resource is the players,
Okay.
which is like, if that's such a cop out. I'm sorry, because I don't have like a big encyclopedia of scary stuff for you because so much of what I love is making the mundane scary. I have like books I really love. I think books do a really good job of speaking to horror RPG as opposed to film because
Hmm.
so much of film is like what tells you that there's tension is an audio cue or a visual or things like
Yeah.
that versus with books it's just words and that's what we're working with here largely it's just words so I really like reading horror horror short stories are very good
Mm,
for prepping for TTRPG but I think the biggest thing is like talking to the players and like because the hardest part is always like what is that theme and how are we going to talk about it and like that's the inspiration for me and everything branches out from that it's like we start from that theme and then we go out from there or that and that usually comes from the players.
yeah. No, I think that's a really, really solid. I mean, I apologize for putting you on the spot because you're right. There's like it's kind of crazy for me to expect you to have like an encyclopedia of resources. But I do like that answer a
I
lot.
mean I have a library of resources at your please support your local library.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that's a really good comparison. I've never heard that comparison before, actually, that a TTRPG is more like a written story than anything else. Um, and one recommendation that I've made on the podcast many times before, again in the context of talking about like setting tone and ambiance and stuff, was a book written a little while ago. I think it was in the 2013s, called "The Beautiful Thing That Awaits Us All" by Laird Barron. It's a collection
Okay.
of short stories that are um, very much like Eldritch inspired, but it's a modern author's take on some of these kind of like cosmic abominations that are out there, and it's like 10 or so short stories. So even if you're not a big aficionado of reading uh, these longer stories, you can punch one of these out pretty quickly, and they're a little spooky. They're
Yeah.
definitely spooky.
Yes, I'm a huge Shirley Jackson fan, for,
Cool.
like which is very, like, domestic suburban horror, because, as I keep saying, I love horror in the mundane, um, but also, like, if you go to, like and this is something that people might not know, is that there is a lot of horror short stories out there, and if you go
Hmm.
to your library and, like, look for horror short stories, you will find compilations on compilations on compilations, largely because we were talking about of like long form storytelling versus like shorter form being more conducive to horror. And so you can just like sit there and it's like a treasure trove of inspiration and ideas, especially if you come in with the same motivation of like trying to get to an underlying theme. And then you start to get a really good at tying motif to theme. So you're like,
Mhm.
okay, so if what we're talking about is fear of the unknown, I've seen in this time they associate it with this, they use this image to bring that, and then you kind of end up with your own mental encyclopedia. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's great. That's really cool. Um, Now I'm just like gushing over cool horror books. Have you read House of Leaves?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's a really that spooked me out for a long time. So I don't know if we really got into like liminal spaces in our conversation today, but
I liminal horror is one of my favorite things ever. And kind of talking about that. So, liminal horror is any horror that draws on the setting of liminal spaces being transitory spaces, spaces that feel like they should be inhabited, but they're
Mhm.
not. And it's a profoundly unnerving thing. It is a wrongness of it. It is a place you are not supposed to be. And also, liminality is used a lot as motif because transitions are really scary going through life. So,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of superstitions around doorways and thresholds and crossroads for this reason. And so, using that kind of setting to tell story is so good. There's a game, Liminal Horror, that I highly recommend. I haven't actually played it, but I've seen people play it, and it looks so good, and it's like my top of my to play list
Yeah,
because it's
yeah, I haven't
specifically
played it
set.
either. Is it called Liminal Horror? Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Okay, I'm
And
gonna
now
have
I'm
to check
second
that
guessing
out too.
myself. Hold on.
Isn't it called
Yeah,
like the back rooms or something, or is that something different?
that's a video game.
Okay, okay.
Um,
So Liminal Horror is like a TTRPG rule set.
yes.
Oh,
Liminal
cool.
Horror is a rule light TTRPG that is a rules light modern cosmic horror game by Goblin Archives.
Cool.
Um,
There you go.
and I have it and I've looked through it. There's modules for it that deal with corporate horror settings and weird sort of like fungal horror, which is another one of my faves. Um, so lots of there's your
That's
treasure
cool.
trove
That's it. There you
of
go. There's
resources.
all kinds of stuff for people to check out.
Mhm.
Speaking of which, I think we did a good job talking about horror for quite some time. I'm sure we could keep going. I would love to, but there's only
I'm
so much
nothing
we
if
could
not a
say.
yapper. Yeah.
Hey, yeah, likewise. So maybe now would be a good time for me to pass the microphone over to you, and you could kind of, if you have any last words as it pertains to horror and running horror games, now would be a good time to do that. And then, of course, if you could also let people listening know where they can watch some of these actual plays that we've been talking about, where they can follow you on socials, where they can ask you questions about horror games if they have them, and all or any projects you've got in the works. Please let us know and plug all of that good stuff.
Okay, so first thing, closing advice. Know why you're telling the story you're telling. It'll end up be a better story and it'll be easier to tell as you go. I say that horror stories are always about connection. It's about taking something, a deep vulnerability and fear you have, and giving it a monstrous face so that we can all look at it and cower together and feel connected in that moment. And like that is the beauty of it. So know your story. What I'm doing right now is I it'll be announced by the time this goes out, so that's great. Will be the kind of things I've been talking about that I ran this week were session zeros for the show I have coming out called Wayward Autumnal, which is a pastoral horror game set in a nightmare dreamscape using that game under the autumn strangely. So where we have in this game, we're gonna have multiple terrors who are there just to make things as strange and unsettling and terrifying as possible. So that is a co-production between myself and Blackwater D&D, and so it's going to be released as a stream on my Twitch, and then also as a podcast on their feed.
Awesome.
And Speaking of my Twitch, places you can find me on the internet. I am across the internet is Gnome_Anne or Anne the Gnome. The funny thing about me is depending on which platform you follow me on, because I'm on 6 of them, you'll get wildly different content. So I spend a lot of time talking about TTRPG and producing TTRPG shows over on Twitch. I do a lot of world building and game prep there, as well as just chatting and hanging out. And I often, the shows once they're done end up on YouTube, and then also I'm on Twitter and stuff, just usually talking about mushrooms. Let's be honest, because that's what I want to talk about. So I'm everywhere. You can't avoid me.
Cool. Yeah, no, I definitely recommend people go check out all of Anne's stuff. There's lots of really cool stuff out there already. All of the shows that you've been talking about and we've been talking about tonight are all up on YouTube, so I recommend people go give them a listen. And I think this is releasing a couple days before your live stream. So no,
So Wayward Autumnal is premiering on Halloween.
okay,
So
there
if
you
it's
go.
before Halloween, right, when you're listening to this, you can catch the premiere. And if it's after Halloween, fear not, it'll be on YouTube. It's okay.
Perfect. There you go. There you go. So yeah, 100%. Go check all that stuff out, and there'll be links in the show notes as well to find Anne in your preferred way to consume internet and socials. So you can go check all that stuff out. So Anne, thank you very much for being here. You are truly the wisest horror person I've spoken to. So I appreciate you taking the time, sharing your knowledge. I feel like we just cracked the tip of the iceberg, but even that is a lot of information for me and for the listeners of Roleplay Chat. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, is my pleasure. So let's with that call it a chat. Thanks, Anne. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of today's episode, friends. If you made it all the way here, you are one of the true MVPs of the Roleplay Chat audience. The other MVPs of the Roleplay Chat audience are the Patreon subscribers who are supporting me through their subscription on Patreon. I'd like to thank Domil's Wondrous Works and Jason over at Shadowmane. Thanks to the two of you for supporting me. Your support allows me to continue to make this show. If you wanted to join them, you're welcome to do so by going onto Patreon and looking for Roleplay Chat. There's also a link down in the show notes. There you can subscribe to the show, where you can get access to the episodes as soon as they're done, as well as extended episodes depending on the tier that you subscribe to. You can also support the show without spending money. You can do that by reviewing the show, spreading the good word, and sharing the show with your friends. If you do that, it really helps to broaden the reach of Roleplay Chat. Recommendations, personal recommendations, and word of mouth really are one of the number one ways for the podcast to be discovered. Also, if you're looking to buy some new tabletop RPG stuff, like dice, miniatures, or new games and rules and supplements, the show notes have links to affiliate links. So if you were to buy things using those affiliate links, for instance, the indie showcase that was spotlighted in today's episode, you can purchase it there, sometimes at a discount too, depending on the link, and a small kickback comes back to me. So yeah, check all that stuff out. The show notes has a handful of links there, things like Hero Forge, Drive-Thru RPG, some awesome dice makers and things like of that nature. So go check it out, and yeah. Thanks again for making it all the way here, and one last thank you to Alex and Chase over at Pocket Bard for allowing me to use their music for the intro and outro of Roleplay Chat.